Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I will talk about notifications. What do you need them for? How do they work? And I will walk you through an example implementation in Flutter using Amazon SNS. First of all, what do we need them for? Imagine a world where you get a chat message on WhatsApp or wherever and you don't get a notification. So if you're not staring at your phone all the time, you will not be informed. That would be fairly useless. Or imagine a calendar that does not give you a notification when your meeting is about to start. It's also a lot less useful. There are more important use cases for notifications. For example, reminding the user base of your app to use your app, to get engaged, right? People download an app, use it for a while, then they stop using it. It can be helpful to get a reminder occasionally, or if you have a shopping app, you can give them discounts to keep them engaged. But without any notifications, you only have email to contact your clients, and you need to reach out to them to get the engagement going and grow your user base. So notifications are super important for a successful app. And even if you find an app that works without notifications, I'm sure it would do better with some notifications. So let's look into it and how they work. I will walk you through an example implementation on Flutter on an iPhone. So first of all, there are two different types of notifications. The first ones are local notifications. They live only on your device and have nothing to do with cloud connectivity with any other service. So for example, you have a calendar and you want to get a reminder of some event that's coming up. That would be a notification only on your device. So that would be one of the examples, but it also gives you a standardized visualization for a notification. And this gets a bit more tangible when we look at push notifications in more detail. Then of course the other type of notification are push notifications. There's an outside service in the cloud that pushes the notifications onto your device. Think of a message you receive in a chat. You have your phone down on the table, you're not staring at it, and it pings or pops up and tells you you received a message. Or it can be some marketing stuff or a special discount. Remember to use the app, all these things, that's also very important. And you can also use it to push a notification to the app, not to the user of your app, but to the app itself, to, for example, tell it needs to be updated because there was a change on the back end and only an updated version of the front end can deal with that. Just another example. I will start with the local notifications also because they're a lot easier to manage. In my sample application, I will use the package Flutter local notifications. I tried a couple, this one worked best. Now in terms of structure, I see here ID, title, message, and payload. These are the four main components. So every notification has an ID. You will see the title and the message shown on the notification to the user, and a payload. ID and payload are invisible. So an ID you can set, you can overwrite a scheduled notification, you can delete one. That's what you need the ID for as a handle. And payload can be some invisible data. So for example, what should happen if you do it? Let's say you have some information you need to pass to the application. A deep link into the application, you have a notification about a new message. When you click on the notification, you jump into the app and show exactly that message that was received. So payload is some hidden data you can process along with the notification. Now in terms of use cases, you can show a notification while you're in the app, while the app is open. You can argue, why would I do that? I can visualize stuff anyway myself. That becomes more clear actually with the push notifications because when the app is open, push notification by default is not shown. So you have to handle that by yourself, define the business logic, and you can use that functionality to show the notification if you want to show it. You can schedule a notification for a defined time. Think of the reminder in your calendar application, and you can remove that, change that for various reasons. Now for push notifications, I used the package push notification. It was a lot harder to find a decent package for those. Structure is basically the same. Depending on the provider you use, you have a couple of additional fields, but more or less it's the same. You can notify from your cloud backend onto the application. There's another feature about silent notification, so that you can use to just send a notification. It will not be shown to the user, and you can, for example, verify is that app still installed on that device, or push some silent information, maybe updates of terms and conditions, discount rates, something like that. And all in all, I have to say it's an extremely cost-effective way for real-time communication with the device. So when you look at SNS, for example, you have the choice between text message, email, and push notifications. A text message can be in the range of 5 cents a piece. It depends on the country, on the network provider, but in my case, it would be roughly 5 cents per piece. 100,000 emails cost maybe $1 or so, and on push notifications you can pay less than $1 for 1 million. So it's extremely cheap. Alright, so how do push notifications work from my implementation point of view? Typically we want to reach a user, so a human being, a person. We see that here on the very left. Now it can be that a user has multiple devices. In that case, we have to direct it to one or all, depending on the use case we have, but we have to manage and control the estate. So if a user, for example, has WhatsApp on his iPhone and on his tablet installed, and we send a text message, do we want both of them to get a notification or just one of them? So we have to be careful here. So we actually have to manage the devices. They have a device ID, and that here we have to be very careful. It does not exactly represent the device, but it's a representation of the installation of an app on a device. So for example, if the app is updated, it gets a new device ID, and we have to make sure we get the most current one. The older one will be disabled, and we can no longer send messages to that one. So our app needs to be defined to have the capability of push notifications. So that's in the configuration of the app. And then the device will manage the registration with the service. So there's a whole range of services. APNS is the Apple push notification service. FCM is from Google, the Fire Cloud messaging service. There's a whole range of others, Baidu in China. But APNS and FCM are the most important in the Western world. So let's have a closer look at these. In my particular case, I prioritize Apple. And then there are third-party services like SNS, Pinpoint, Google has services. So pretty much anybody offers additional services to manage your push notifications. So when the user logs in from his app on the device, we need to make sure the device token or device ID is transmitted along with his connection request, with his login. And we need to store that somehow to make sure we have that device ID connected to that user. So if you want to send a notification to the user, we pick that up and send it to that device. So there's a bit of background configuration to be done. We need to configure the application of the app in the Apple developer website as having the capability to send, to receive, to process push notifications. And we need to get a certificate from Apple that we can then use to send the notifications. So the certificate is basically the key that allows you to send to Apple. And we take it from Apple and give it, in our case, to AWS SNS, register it there. and that allows SNS on AWS to send notifications to Apple that will be routed to that device. Now on the application side in Flutter, we need to configure the capability to process push notifications. We need to make sure that the permissions are managed, so the user can, of course, permit or not permit the application to show push notifications. And we need to include the package that we use for the whole processing here. Then on the implementation side, first one was configuration, now implementation. We need to make sure the application takes a device token and sends that device token to the cloud, where we then in the backend process it accordingly. Now on the mobile device, we get the token from the native part of our Flutter application. So you have the Flutter application and you have a little bit of an add-on for Apple iPhone. It's in the app delegate, and there's something similar also for Android. So here we get the token, then we need to take it into Flutter and then send it to the backend. Now on the backend side, we need to be able to receive this device token along with the user ID, and then we need to register it with SNS. That creates an endpoint that can be reached via the push notifications. So this endpoint is then represented with an ARN, and this ARN we store in our database along with the user. That way we can pick up the ARN when we want to send something to the user, and we can call SNS to send a push notification to this ARN, and it will be pushed to that user. So that's a theory how the whole thing works together. So let's look at the implementation and the different bits and pieces of that. In Xcode, you need to add the capabilities. So here under Xcode project, signing and capabilities, you can add capabilities here by clicking the plus button, and then you can select from a list of capabilities and add push notifications, and that way it is in that application, and Xcode will add the functionality to register with the service. So let's look at our application in VS Code in Flutter. Under iOS Runner App Delegate, we have the specific code that is only for the iOS interaction. And here we have added the functionality to register for remote notification. And here we have the functionality to get the device token. If the registration went well, we have that token. We can print it out here just for debug purposes. And we get it then here in the Flutter method channel. We make it available for a function call that we can call from Flutter itself under local methods, and receive that one with get device token. We return that token here, device token.map. And with this function in the app delegate, we can make it available for a call in the Flutter Dart part. And that we call right here. We call the method channel with exactly the same string, with the same name. And we invoke the method getDeviceToken, which we defined in the app delegate. And with that, we can retrieve the device token and have it in our Flutter app. Now, what we do with that device token is basically in the login call to the backend that I do anyway, I just add this device token along with the authorization token into the header, and I can retrieve it in the backend and do the whole registration, endpoint creation, and store that in a database. So once we retrieve the device token, there's a little bit of initialization to be done, like how should the notification be displayed, the icon, all these things. But most important is really the device token, and that I try to fetch right when the application is being started. So with this part here, I can schedule a reminder, a notification that will pop up at a defined time. So for that, I have to, well, first take the date time of that specific event when I want to have it, create the date time. I need to make sure that this date time is in the future. If I schedule a reminder for something in the past, that's not going to work well. And then I call this Flutter local notifications plugin with zone schedule and can then schedule that notification. So I need to come up with an ID for that one that I create right here, then a title and a text, and the time zone specific date time when it should be triggered. Now let's go to the AWS console, to the service Amazon SNS, and see how the platform application needs to be configured to process these. So I've already set up a platform application here, and we can have a look at that configuration. So right now it's enabled for Apple iOS push notifications, and you need to provide the Apple credentials to send the notifications to Apple push notification service. So under developer.apple.com, I have the corner for certificates where I can create a certificate for Apple push services. So by creating here, I can go to the Apple push notification service, sandbox and production, and create a certificate for that application. So I need to specify that one, and then I can upload the certificate that will be signed. So that I create in my local keychain application, upload it here, can download it again, then signed from Apple, and that I can then upload into the AWS SNS as a P12 file, along with the password to use that certificate. So that's how the creation of that certificate works and how you get it from Apple. And similar on Google side, you log into the Google Cloud, create the credentials there and upload them here in AWS SNS, and you can use them for the Fire Cloud messaging service. Now also worth mentioning is here I see the endpoints. Right now I have 2 endpoints registered, and there's an SDK that allows me to register endpoints and use the ARNs that are assigned when I register an endpoint, and I can use these ARNs to send a message to that endpoint. So I can create that endpoint manually by entering the device token right here, and it will create the endpoint, or I can use the SDK. Now this is my Lambda function that is called every time I open a connection to the backend. That means every time I log into my application. And here you see the function that registers the endpoint. So I get the token, the device token, from the header where my Flutter application puts it in. So I can retrieve that here in this Lambda function. And then I have created this register endpoint function where I can make that call here under SNS create platform endpoint and hand over these parameters like the platform application on, the endpoint, the token, and empty attributes which I'm not using right now. And as a result, I get the endpoint on, which I will later on then store in a DynamoDB. Now this function, this Lambda function, is being used every time a user of the app is invited to an event. So then I need to send a notification to the user. I have this function here where I can send the text to that user. So step 1 is to retrieve from my DynamoDB that user, what is his on. So that's what I'm picking up from this table here. I hand over the user ID and retrieve the ARN. And as a result, I get the endpoint on, which I will later on then store in a DynamoDB. Now this function, this Lambda function, is being used every time a user of the app is invited to an event. So then I need to send a notification to the user. So step 1 is to retrieve from my DynamoDB that user, what is his on. So that's what I'm picking up from this table here. I hand over the user ID and retrieve the ARN. and then I use that to pass it on to the other function that is right up here. Send notification to the text to that ARN, and here it just sends an alert. Please open your app, test title, and sends it to here under SNS publish, and then these parameters and that fires off the push notification to that endpoint. So one more thing I need to mention on these Lambda functions: they need to have the IAM policy to allow them to call the SNS service. So that needs to be added to their role. And for that, in the IAM section of AWS, we can simply add Amazon SNS full access. Of course, you can be more specific, but this is like a very basic way to authorize your Lambda functions to use SNS to register an endpoint, but then also delete endpoints and all that. So you might limit that access, and also to send notifications to the endpoints. So with these things, you should be able to configure the systems and implement notifications for your Flutter application, be it local notifications or push notifications. Let me know in the comments below if that worked for you, how you use the notifications in your application. If it was helpful for you, please like, and if you want more content like this, subscribe or watch one of these videos.